The following is a production of Medfield TV, community shows.
Well, welcome to the February 4th edition of the Medfield Board of Selectmen's meeting. As those of you who are regular attendees know, we record the meeting and it goes out on Medfield TV, so you are being recorded in this meeting. If you have anything you'd like to say, we'd ask you to make sure you get the microphone that's over on the table there. It's not a microphone to amplify your voice in the room, it's to be able to pick up the audio feed for the Medfield TV broadcast. So if you do that, we'd appreciate it. Before we get started, also I'd just like to take a moment of appreciation for our service members who are serving across the globe in defense of our country. Thank you. Okay, a couple of announcements here. First one is kind of a sad one here. For those who may not know, we're extending our condolences to the family of Ralph Parmesan. Ralph passed away, I believe, Christine, last Thursday, and I guess you'd have to say, true to form, he came and paid his taxes earlier that day. Ralph served the town as Director of Civil Defense in 1956, a member of the Senior Tax Write-Off Committee from 2005 to 2006, and he was on the Conservation Commission from 1993 to 2018, so a total of 25 years of service. Speaking personally, one of the things that I've been happy about that I've been able to do in serving the town is that on a couple of occasions I've had reason to meet someone who I had no idea, even though I've been here for 25 years, I had no idea who they were until relatively recently. And I happened to attend a Conservation Commission meeting probably 2 years ago, which was the first time that I ever met Ralph Parmesan. So he'd been here a long time, I just never met him. And he really ran a good committee. I came away from that experience, having talked with him a couple times over the years, just really liking him, regretting that it had taken me so long to meet him. And so even though I didn't know him all that long, I was awfully sorry to hear that he had passed away at the end of the week last week. I believe the visiting hours for him are Thursday afternoon from 4 to 8. And then I believe the service is Friday morning at Vine Lake Cemetery, 10 o'clock maybe? 10 o'clock. So for any of you who knew Ralph, he was a good guy. We're going to miss him. Second item, Representative Sean Dooley is holding office hours on Thursday, February 6th from 11:30 to 12:30 at the Townhouse Warrant Committee room on the first floor. That's the room that's right inside the front door there to the right. Also, Norfolk County Registry of Deeds is going to be holding it. That's William O'Donnell. He's going to be holding office hours on Thursday, February 13th, from 10 to 12 at the Townhouse here in the Chenery Meeting Room. So if you have any issues with deeds, your deeds, or if you just have interest in various deeds on property in Medfield, I have to say I've never seen a register of deeds do as many office hour calls in towns as he does. It almost makes me feel bad I don't have some good reason to go talk to him about something, just so I would have an excuse to talk to him about something. But he's routinely in touch with us.
He's usually set up to actually be able to record documents from
yes.
here.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I think it sounded like he was also prepared for anyone who's interested in doing kind of historic research. I think there's things that are online, you might not know how they work, but I think he's prepared to also explain how that stuff works as well.
They'll do a full demonstration for you here and help you search anything you need.
So definitely the most active register of deeds that I've ever run across, and I'm really kind of sorry I don't find some reason to go work with him on something here. The first item we have, unless there's no special schedules here, I don't think nobody that has to leave immediately or anything like that. So the first item we have is a citizen comment discussion. Brian Nixon, I think you have the lead with the group. The discussion is around the Rose Bay project. So we'll turn the floor. We might ask you if you'd like to get up there.
Deirdre Murphy's going to speak on behalf of the neighborhood.
Okay.
Hi, Deirdre Murphy, 45 Pound Street. I'm just going to read some prepared remarks in the interest of making sure that I'm brief and concise. So thank you for allowing us time on your agenda this evening. Since I and other neighbors learned about the Rose Bay Development Project, we've stated many times that we're not opposed to affordable housing or to a reasonably sized, affordable senior housing development next to Tilden Village. In fact, all of us are already neighbors to Tilden Village. However, we're here tonight to discuss a serious concern about the legitimacy of the process, specifically whether the process the Medfield Housing Authority followed, which led to the Rose Bay proposal for 45 units on Pound Street, is legally valid. As you know, the Medfield Housing Authority proposes to lease the undeveloped Tilden Village land to Newgate Housing, a private developer, to build the Rose Bay project. Based on documents I obtained through public records requests, I became concerned that the Housing Authority, a state agency, did not comply with the state public bidding law when it contracted with Newgate Housing. Although I first raised this issue last November with the board and with the Department of Housing and Community Development, my concern was ignored. We then engaged attorney Dan Hill of Hill Law to advise us. I hope you have reviewed the Attorney Hill's letter. If not, the letter is posted on the ZBA website under the folder for the January 22 Rose Bay hearing. Attorney Hill confirmed that the Housing Authority is subject to the public bidding law, Chapter 30B, and that the Housing Authority failed in two significant ways to comply with that law when it issued an RFP and subsequently entered into an option for a ground lease with Newgate Housing. As Attorney Hill also points out in his letter, the Housing Authority also has not followed state regulations that apply to housing authorities that want to dispose of certain real estate. Considering the involvement of the board and the Affordable Housing Trust in the Rose Bay project to date, I and other neighbors present would like to know what the board's position is regarding the Rose Bay project, considering these two legal violations that undermine the legitimacy of the process. Thank you.
Are there any other comments to supplement that from the group that's here for this issue?
We're gonna allow those comments later.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I'm just, if there's anything you want to put on the table before we start. Maybe I'll start with my understanding of I'm flanked by the lawyers on this Board of Selectmen. So I am the non-lawyer, but as I see it, there's two issues here. One of them is probably the precedent issue, which is you all are challenging basically the legality or the propriety of the contract which has been awarded to Newgate to undertake this project. And I think that's a legal question, and it's probably a prerequisite legal question. You didn't bring up, I think, what I've probably had more detailed discussions about, which is the advisability of the project itself, assuming it's a project that can go ahead. So I'm going to suggest in this discussion that we deal with the first issue first, to see if we can get past that first issue, or if I'm looking toward you, Mark, but I think we want to talk about that issue first, just to simply see where we are with regard to the propriety of the contract.
As was noted in her notes, the Medfield Housing Authority, as with any local housing authority, is not a town board under the auspices of the selectmen or the town charter. They're a state agency. If there was assuming they are under 30B, Section 16, which has to do with land acquisition and disposition, that is, there's a separate process for enforcement of that that's wholly outside the town's purview. Generally, I actually spoke briefly with Attorney Hill. I was speaking with him on another matter, and he brought this up, so we did exchange views on this. 30B Section 16 in particular is enforced by the Inspector General's office. There are other provisions of Chapter 30B that have broader remedies, and indications of who can enforce, but 30B16 appears to be within the purview of the Inspector General. So that would be, it's a separate process and oversight that, in all due respect, I don't think involves this board.
So I think that may be one of the issues around the proper, was the plan to dispose of the property properly done, or is it, who gets the authority to do that? In my reading the materials, I think you're questioning a second piece, which is that the RFP itself called out consulting services and called out a series of tasks that were associated with that, which I think in your second or third information request, you pointed out that this was consulting services. Was there a separate development contract awarded? And based on the information you provided, the answer to that's no. Where does the review of the propriety of the contract itself, as the statement of work was written versus what's subsequently been done, where would that review take place?
It's all one and the same. It's under the process that was followed to dispose of the property, which would be Chapter 30B, Section 16, and regulations of the Inspector General's office, and guidances from that office.
Including the contract that's higher, there's one issue of the legal disposal of the property. There's another issue of the nature of the contract with Newgate, the scope of work of Newgate.
Well,
As
again,
developer-
it still
falls under this.
Well, it's the affordable, it's the housing, it's the Medfield Housing Authority. It's not the town.
Reportable to, effectively as a state agency, is what you're
Right.
saying.
The housing I don't know if I said housing authority, but that's who I meant to say. The housing authority is a state agency, and not under our oversight purview or anything else. So it's between them and the state.
I'll start, now we'll hear from two lawyers if you have anything to add.
Well, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, number one, obviously, and it kind of goes without saying, that the Medfield Housing Authority has to follow whatever law is applicable to it. You know, I read Mr. Hill's letter and the other comments. I read the RFP, and my kind of conclusion between the two of it is sort of, I don't know, right? I don't know whether, given the nature of the transaction with Newgate, which is not a straight 99-year lease, it's not a sale of land. I suspect if you ask the Housing Authority, they would say that it might fall within sort of the subclauses for at the discretion of the MHA, and et cetera, right? But that being said, I mean, the risk to the town is we're going to get a lawsuit no matter what if this project is approved. And so the interest in the town is making sure that the likelihood of success of that lawsuit is as low as possible. And so to the extent that the neighbors have standing to enforce this provision, which is not clear, and I suspect if it was clear that they did, they would not have raised it at this point, because it would have been more effective to raise it later in the process to disrupt the proposal. We should make sure and encourage the Medfield Housing Authority to square this circle, right? And I will say, as having supported providing money to the Medfield Housing Authority to hire a lawyer to negotiate this contract, and again, I'm not going to comment on the lawyers for either side of this transaction, but I would think if you are negotiating a contract on behalf of a public body for the type of transaction, which is not a, you know, it's not a typical lease. I mean, it is a financing transaction and a temporary lease, because it does revert back to the housing, I think it's after 30 years as part of this. I would think the lawyers, both for the Housing Authority and for Newgate, would have an interest in ensuring up front that the procurement was proper and there'd be no question about it, because it's a significant risk to Newgate if you get 2 years into this project, and even if there were no opposition from the neighbors and no lawsuit, the Inspector General could look at it and say, well, no, this was not proper, we've got to go back and redo it, particularly where it's pretty easy to remedy. Now, we haven't heard from the Housing Authority, we haven't heard from their counsel, we haven't heard from Newgate's counsel, so we don't know what the other side of the story is on the procurement process. But I certainly think they ought to comply with the rules, and they ought to comply with the rules whether they want to go and get an opinion from the Inspector General's office as to whether, in the view of the Inspector General, the contract that's proposed with Newgate falls within the scope of the RFP and thus it was proper, or if it wasn't, what the remedy for that would be, which likely would be to reissue an RFP and give other people a chance to bid on it. And you may well have other developers who would bid on it, who might offer more than Mr. McMillan is offering. They might put money into it if they think they can build a larger and more profitable project there. They may offer the Medfield Housing Authority more money, and the Housing Authority would have to take, a higher bid, most likely, depending on how, they had a lot of criteria in this particular RFP. But whatever they did, if they had to reissue it, they would have to take whatever the best offer is they got. And I don't know whether they would get other proposals. I don't know what it would be, but obviously if the view from the Inspector General is that this is not going to be a proper procurement, from the town's perspective, we want them to clear that up sooner rather than later, because given the importance of this particular development within our overall housing production plan, we'd need to resolve that sooner rather than later, rather than exposing the town to the risk that the project gets filed up for what would be a procedural defect on the part of the Housing Authority. I don't think there's any evidence here that there was actual corruption or anything untoward. I don't think Mr. McMillan is related to somebody on the Housing Authority or bribed somebody or something like that. But obviously, any public body that is engaged in a procurement has to follow the rules. And if they didn't, they should remedy it sooner rather than later. And so I don't know that necessarily affects or how that would affect the town and the ZBA process. I would think we wouldn't want to wouldn't want the ZBA to have wasted all this time. And so I don't know whether that would actually be an obstacle to completing the process while the Housing Authority resolves the ownership issues and resolves what happens. And it may be that the end result, if they do issue another RFP and somebody else buys it, that whoever gets it has to kind of step into the shoes of Newgate. But I don't think we should kind of roll back to the beginning and say we're going to start this over again, because a lot of work has already been put into this at this point. And so I think my view of what we ought to do is we ought to encourage the Housing Authority to resolve this issue, respond to the concerns that have been addressed, and clear this up. And I will say we have an Affordable Housing Trust Board meeting a week from yesterday. And I think we are going to ask about how our money was spent and what those lawyers did who were paid $25,000 to represent the Housing Authority. Because look, the Housing Authority here, and I have sympathy for them because they have no money. The director runs 4 different housing authorities, and so I have sympathy for how they got there in the first place, because it's essentially a volunteer board of Medfield residents on the Housing Authority board with a director who runs 4 housing authorities. So I can certainly see how in the initial piece here they may have made an innocent error. However, once they got counsel to go through this, I would suspect that I would have hoped that this issue would have been resolved. Now, it may have been. There's not been a response that I've seen from Mr. McMillan or from the Housing Authority, but I think they do need to get that resolved, and it's up to the Housing Authority to resolve it. And obviously, if they don't, and it was not a proper contract, then they're not going to go anywhere with it. And I think that's but I've not seen any court decision or Inspector General guidance that specifically addresses this type of transaction and how this type of transaction is defined as between the categories in the RFP and a lease or a sale of property. I just haven't seen that particular. And my guess is there may not be a ton of it because it's a relatively new financing mechanism for housing authorities. And I don't know the answer to that, but I think the Housing Authority has to get an answer to that and has to resolve it. And whatever, I don't know if we have any influence with them, but we'd encourage them. I think we should encourage them to resolve this question sooner rather than later and respond to the concerns that were raised on this front.
Pete?
So despite your introduction about being surrounded by lawyers, I guess I would sort of follow up on Mike's comments to indicate that I don't know the legal answers. I don't practice in this area at all, so I don't know the actual legal correctness of what was done. I also agree with Mark that this isn't really a selectman matter, other than the fact that this is a project that is part of our housing production plan that satisfies needs there, and so that the town does have some interest in having elderly housing at that site. The Board of Selectmen has long been advocating and asking the Medfield Housing Authority to build additional housing at that site. And that would be in the town's interest to have that happen. I know that when this project initially was suggested, I did talk to Mr. McMillan to ask him if it could be 2 stories, if it had to be 45 units, and I got answers that it had to be 3 stories and it had to be 45 units, I think, and so that, but I think that it's gonna, I think you're absolutely right, that we need an answer as soon as possible as to the legal issues, and that we should encourage the Housing Authority to get those. It raises issues of concern. I don't have a clue as to the correctness or the propriety of them, but I think that certainly the town has an interest in finding that out as soon as possible.
Let me, if I may just add, housing authorities in the general laws are in with, I think, Chapter 121A, which is like, it deals with derelict properties and a whole bunch of urban renewal and all kinds of other stuff. And it's a very complex, elaborate statutory framework, and then housing authorities are shoved into the middle of that. Plus, they have, there's myriad regulations. It's entirely possible that this falls within an exemption to procurement. I did some quick research. I couldn't put my hands on it, but that's not to say it doesn't exist. But again, that would be something that they ought to be doing their due diligence about.
And as I understand it, I mean, they can contact the Inspector General's office and ask, right? I mean,
Oh, they have a,
Right, I
yes, the
mean, it's
Inspector
not-
General's
yeah.
office has a legal team and
Right.
everything else.
I mean, they can ask the question. I mean, if it's a gray area, or if this somehow was not resolved by the Housing Authority in Newgate as part of, I mean, what was a very, I mean, I think the negotiations went on for 6+ months, supposedly. And so if it was not resolved in that process, I would think they could contact the Inspector General's office and get a view from the Inspector General. about it.
They'll actually do a full-blown investigation if they feel it's warranted, the Inspector General's office.
Yeah, or it may be easy enough, they can just say, hey, no, this is, you can't do this, you gotta start, whatever it is. I mean, it seems like that would be the logical next place for them to go, unless this was resolved and they just haven't responded to the letter for one reason or another. I mean, that seems to me what they ought to do. I mean,
And as far as I know, anybody can contact the Inspector General's office and bring something to their attention. It's not confined to either the housing authority or the developers, so.
But I think they would be well advised to do that and get it cleared up, one way or the other. Because I don't think it's I'm sure there is a remedy that they could pursue to resolve the issue, if in fact, this was not, the contract they're proposing to enter into, the option was not within the four corners of the RFP. And I can't answer that question one way or the other, just given the nature of the transaction. If this were obviously a sale of land, it would be different, or a 99-year lease would be different. For this kind of transaction, which it's kind of a hybrid, I just don't know how they define it.
If it's an interest in land and it has a certain value, that triggers 30B, Section 16. But then, again, whether there's exemption somewhere else,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. But then if that didn't comply, I think they would have to reissue the RFP.
That's
give
generally the
other-
case. The
yeah,
IG has the authority to set aside a
yeah,
transaction.
and give other people a chance to bid on it and make other
Right.
proposals. So I think that would be I mean, usually when there is litigation over these kind of things, it's from a losing bidder or somebody who would have bid. I mean, that's usually the aggrieved party in these kind of situations, as far as I understand it.
So back to the, go ahead.
I have a question for Mike. Could you give a little bit more clarification, please, on what you meant by when, I think you said you didn't think there was any bribery, or because the director runs 4 agencies, it may have been an oversight, like, why that would be relevant to what we're discussing tonight?
Well, I think, I mean, you're challenging the validity of the procurement process, right? You could have a procedural violation in good faith, which is one thing. I mean, if you had come forward with evidence that there was something untoward or this was kind of an underhanded, I mean, the whole core purpose of these kind of procurement regulations is sort of everything's above board, everybody gets a chance to bid, it's sort of transparency, sunlight is the best disinfectant, that kind of thing, right? That's why these processes exist generally. And on a spectrum from procedural error, honest mistake by a busy person, to genuinely corrupt transaction, I think it's more on, if you're correct, and that this is not, the proposed contract is not within the RFP, I just see, based on the evidence, it's more on the innocent error as opposed to corrupt situation. If you had a corrupt situation, you'd have more stuff to look at. And so that's my only point, is that if it's a procedural error in good faith, then it can be corrected, whereas if you had a bigger problem here, which I don't see any evidence of, it might call for us to take a different step or a different approach.
Okay, thanks. Because I have a different viewpoint of a couple things I'd like to share with the board. And one is a letter that was written by the Medfield Housing Authority to the Hometown Weekly editor. And in there, I'm quoting, it says, "The plans have been revised to appease and support the wishes of the abutters." That's a quote that the MHA put in print. And that's completely false. That is not something that's accurate. Furthermore, at a ZBA meeting, the director stood up and said there were 500 individuals on the waiting list at Medfield. And so one of my neighbors wrote and said, "Can we see the public records for that?" And there was only 28 people on the waiting list. And so I understand some of this is political, and what we're discussing tonight is legal issues. But when I heard your commentary of that, I just didn't want the people at home to be led a certain way when I've seen something that leads me to believe something else.
Mr. Chairman.
Well, I wasn't commenting on the accuracy of every statement that the director had made. I was talking about the procurement process. And obviously, you have disagreements with that, and
I understand. It's just it was just to not set forth that it may be completely innocent. It may not be, and I think that's what we'll find out.
So I'm here to advise on legal process. And we've talked about whether or not there's a valid contract with the housing authority and this particular developer. The developer, in turn, has filed with the Zoning Board of Appeals, and there's a pending quasi-judicial proceeding there, of which the ZBA by statute is the sole determiner. They're sitting as impartial fact finders. They will take evidence, they are taking evidence, and they'll make a determination. And they're basically, that's their authority under Chapter 40B, so that's the process.
That's with regard to the actual project as proposed, or
Well,
when you say
as to some of the
quasi-judiciary.
comments that are being made now, and what's being proposed and what isn't, and what concessions have been made and what haven't been, and what's the need and what isn't, that's all relevant to to the zoning board's proceeding, but, it's inappropriate to try this in the media or other forums. There is a particular process which will result in a decision which is then appealable by anybody that's aggrieved by the decision.
So back to the non-lawyer, go ahead, Dieter.
Well, actually, I'm a lawyer. I've been practicing for
I'm
more
I'm
than
even more surrounded by lawyers than I realized, okay.
practicing for more than 30 years. I've read a lot of statutes. I'm not a 40B lawyer by any stretch of the imagination, but I've spent a lot of time on it in the last few months. And with all due respect, I think this is being made much more complicated than it actually is. It's very clear that the Housing Authority issued an RFP for development consulting services, not to build a development for 40 to 60 units of housing. I was the first person probably in town to see the RFP when I got it through the public records request. As far as I know, the Selectmen hadn't seen it, the Affordable Trust had not seen it, and the Department of Housing and Community Development had not seen it. It's very clear what it is. It says nothing about 40 to 60 units. What it also doesn't do is talk about, in any way, shape, or form, disposing of any real estate owned by the Housing Authority at 30 Pound Street, as would be required under Section 16 of Chapter 30B. It's quite clear. It's really not that complicated.
So I think that piece of what you've said here, the answer from based on Mark's counsel, is that that message is a message that you need to send to the state and make the case to the state. This is not us saying yes or no or anything. It's just that you're making your appeal to people who don't have the jurisdiction over that call.
Gus, with all due respect, as you know, I've made the case to the state. I think it's the responsibility of the selectmen, as the chief executor of this town, to take some leadership on this issue. We have a serious problem with this project. You know, Mr. Marcucci said a minute ago that he didn't think the neighbors have standing, and if we thought we had, we would be raising this later. We don't want to have a lawsuit, but we can have a lawsuit. I'm quite clear that we have standing. As town council pointed out, the neighbors, as well as the Board of Selectmen, as well as the Housing Authority, could ask the Inspector General to go forward with an inspection on this RFP issue. It's time for the Board of Selectmen to take some leadership on this. I raised it in November. We don't want to wait. We don't want any more town resources, the resources of people, the resources of money to be wasted while this issue is unresolved. We had to hire our own lawyer just to have any consideration of this issue. It's time for the board
Let me ask
to
you a
weigh in.
question. You said you went to the state. Who did you talk to in the state, and what did you tell
I
them?
wrote
and
a
what did
letter
they
to
say in
Catherine
response?
Racer, who was the one who issued the project eligibility letter. After probably 45 days of not responding, including to a public records request, she told me that they don't have any responsibility for 30B. That's it.
So here, and in your letters, you've asserted that what you're saying is true. I'm not fighting you on this. I'm basically trying to figure out whose fight is it with who, under what circumstances. So don't take what I'm doing here, pushing back, as a position on what's right or what's wrong. But in your letter, the materials you sent to us, you were asserting things as fact, but they were nonetheless assertions that, as far as I can tell, have to be resolved at the state level, if I'm following this right. I think you have two assertions. One of them I didn't fully appreciate to start with until you spoke tonight, which has to do with how the under 30B, how the land is being disposed of. That's one thing, and I think that's what you've mostly talked to. I saw another assertion in your materials, which is that you believe that the contract as advertised and as subsequently issued in terms of the scope that Newgate is undertaking is not correct. So the scope that was called out, the nature of the contract that was advertised in the RFP and awarded is not consistent with the actual work that Newgate is taking on in this project.
That's another section 30B. It's still
It may
under
still be
30B.
under, well,
It
to me,
is.
it's two different questions. You have the authority to, do you have the authority, or has the land been properly disposed of under 30B? And then there's a more general question about, has the contract been properly let in light of the process that got us?
It's all
the
under
contract?
30B.
It may be under 30B, but if it wasn't a 30B issue, it would still be a valid contract.
So the short answer is, or the short question is, has anybody contacted the Inspector General's office, and if not, why not?
So I think that is the right question, and has.
Well, I might ask why the Board of Selectmen has not contacted the Inspector General's office. Why is it up to the neighbors to do all the legal work and pay for it with regard to this
Because we had
project?
no, speaking for myself, because I had no concern, that this was an area I had no concern about. Until
Gus, I wrote you a letter in November about this very issue, and when you
That
say I'm
doesn't
just
automatically,
when you're saying
the-
I made assertions, it's backed up with documents from the public records request. It's not mere assertions.
if you, well, you're a lawyer, every lawyer makes an argument for their position. They believe that position to be true. I think you believe that position to be true. I'm saying it's an assertion until this is resolved. It sounds like it has to be resolved at the state level. So it's not, just because you sent a letter and said this is true, doesn't automatically mean we take that up and run with it and say, oh, this is true because Deidre sent us a letter. The context up till now has been a group of people who I understand, and I'm not condemning, who have not wanted this project to go through. And that's been in competition with the town's interest in trying to take advantage of senior housing in a place that it made sense, in terms of not the specific project. So the point I'm trying to make is, because you sent a letter in November doesn't mean this all crystal clear showed up, and, oh, yes, we have to take action. You've sent more, you've made a good argument, so I think the merits of your argument, whether you're right or wrong, I don't know, but the merits, I personally buy into. It's two proper questions to ask. One is about the disposition of the 30B, and the second is the propriety of the actual contract itself. So I'm sympathetic to the questions you're asking, but I think due diligence on our part has us need to figure out, A, is this in fact an action that we need to take? And B, where is the proper theater for that to be taken? And what I think I heard tonight is the place where this gets resolved is at the state level, because we have no authority over the housing authority or anything. The case you're making is, well, nonetheless, you now know that there's a contract that we're questioning, and we think you, the Board of Selectmen, should go to the IG's office, and I don't think any of you have contacted the IG's office. I think that's where things sit right now. Have I got it?
We were waiting until this meeting, but we will be
That's fine.
contacting the
That's
IG's
fine.
office.
I'm just trying to understand where we are now and where we need to go next.
Yeah, I don't think we have any disagreement that this needs to be sorted out.
Right.
And I think the housing authority should do it affirmatively to sort it out. I mean, this is their RFP, it's their contract, it's their process. If they want to defend their process, they should defend their process. And they should clear up this issue, because they have the same interest in clearing up this issue as anybody else does. And so, you know, if I were them, and if they asked my opinion, I would, and I've spoken to one member of the board and told them they should do that they should affirmatively resolve this question and get this cleared up, because it's not going to go away. And if this is, if again, not having heard the other side, but assuming this is correct, this is something they've got to resolve.
So I guess I would follow up by saying that not everything in the town is under the purview of the Board of Selectmen, and this issue clearly is not. It's an issue for the Housing Authority, which is a state agency, and the Zoning Board of Appeals at this point. I mean, the Board of Selectmen really has no authority to deal with this at this point. I think if we interposed ourselves in some way, that might be an inappropriate thing for us to be doing, where that's not part of the schemes that are set up for determining these things. Clearly, the issues that you raise are, you know, they caught my attention, and so that as an attorney, at least I looked at that and I said, oh, that's a very interesting argument. I don't know the answer to that. But, you know, it's certainly noticeable. And it needs to get resolved. But the Board of Selectmen is not the area, the agency that's going to resolve that, I don't think, for you.
So the fun part about open meetings is you get to watch the selectmen argue with each other real time. Mark, I'm going to invite you at some point here to jump in. I am going to argue an opposite view. I think what we've established is the Board of Selectmen has no statutory authority over any of this. We don't get to tell the Housing Authority what it needs to do. We don't get to tell the housing folks at the state level what we need to do. Deidre, what I hear you saying is, well, you do have an interest in senior housing in town. You, up to this point, have a direct interest in what this project is all about. We've put information forward to you that at least makes a strong case that something hasn't been done entirely according to the way it should be done in terms of just fundamental contracting principles. And rather than having citizens, some of whom have already hired their own lawyer, pursue this issue directly with the IG, we'd like the Board of Selectmen to pursue this directly with the IG. That's what I think I hear you asking for. Is that fair? Okay. Mark, I don't find that unreasonable in the sense that we could certainly stick our nose in that, in representing that issue to the IG's office. The reason we would do it is actually, we do have an interest in making sure that if this project is going to go through, we don't want it to get 3/4 of the way through and then have the whole thing blow up because somebody finally does push it and have the IG put it to a full stop halt. Having said that, I can, and I'm going to listen to you two guys, you can mull this over because I'm now the outlier, or maybe I am. But Mark, is there anything we need to consider as a Board of Selectmen that would cause us to elect not to, at least submit the inquiry? We want to do this with the housing. We're not starting fights here, but send an inquiry into the IG for a confirmation of the propriety of how the land will be disposed and the propriety of how this particular contract was let. And I'm saying this without any, back to the point you made, Brian, I don't want to imply any negatives against Newgate. All of my experience is that if we're going to do this with somebody, they're as good a company as I can think of, so there's no.
I would frankly advise against the Board of Selectmen taking the initiative. I think Pete somewhat touched upon it. The town does have separate interests here. These people may have public concerns about enforcing the law, but they also have self-interest, which they've made very clear up to this point. It's a matter of doing an investigation of at some level, at the local level, and then turning those materials over to the Inspector General's office. And they're available to anyone that's making a complaint. I'm not sure what they would do this late in the day, but we've got other relationships with the housing production plan, the housing authority, and perhaps this developer, that I would advise against taking the initiative on this. If you want to do a letter to the housing authority, expressing the concerns that you have as a result of this meeting and strongly recommending that they seek the advice of the Inspector General, and leave the burden on them to do so or not, I have no problem with that.
So it seems to me at this point, it's going to get to the Inspector General very quickly, regardless. Either you're going to do it, Deidre, or the Housing Authority is going to do it. Hopefully, someone's going to do it. So it doesn't, I don't know that it needs to come from the Board of Selectmen of the town. They just need to weigh in and give an opinion on it, I think.
Mark, is there legal downside to the town of contacting the Inspector General? I understand about all the issues around approving a specific project. but is
Possibly,
there-
because there are adverse consequences from Inspector General's involvement, potentially very negative consequences to parties to a transaction. And
Asking the Inspector General to affirm that the contemplated
that's
disposition is
that's not how it works. They're going to do an investigation based on information that's brought to their attention. I don't know what level of detail they want, but frankly, as a practical matter, if you've gone through the time and effort to put these materials to DHCD and been told that's not our jurisdiction, we don't enforce it, take the same materials and submit them to the Inspector General's office.
Right, but I mean, there's a preliminary step to that though as well, Mark. And I mean, I would say that, from my perspective, if this kind of issue had come to our attention for an RFP that we had issued, and, I came to the conclusion that the concerns were valid, I don't think I'd wait for the Inspector General and say, you know what, we made a mistake, we're gonna reissue the RFP, we're gonna fix the mistake.
Right.
And so it seems to me that the Housing Authority may and may not, I don't know, in response to this, say, well, gee, you know what, we hadn't thought of this and we want to fix this and fix it themselves, right? And so, I mean, I think, I agree to your point, Gus. I mean, I don't, I know where Mark is going with the concern that he has with respect to raising with the Inspector General, but I think we could certainly send a letter to the Housing Authority and telling them that we would like them to resolve this question in the first instance. I mean, who knows? Maybe they'll produce a legal opinion from their counsel saying, we looked at this at the time and here's why it's okay. And maybe not. And maybe they'll conclude, you know what, either they agree with it or it's too close for comfort or whatever it's going to be, and they will take steps affirmatively to resolve the issue themselves. And I think that's probably, having not heard back from them in response to any of these concerns, I think the first response should come from the Housing Authority. And I certainly think from the town's perspective, we ought not, go ahead, we shouldn't get further along in this process until it's resolved, in the sense that, we don't want to be in a situation a year and a half from now and get an unfavorable answer and then be back back at square one with something else at this site or something else someplace else. I mean, I think it's a lot of time has been invested so far, and I don't think this would take months and months and months to resolve. And so I would be in favor of a letter initially to the Housing Authority, encouraging them and their council to respond to this question and address and clear up this issue. Would that be within our would we take any risk in writing to the housing authority?
No, I think that's what I suggested a
Yeah,
minute
I mean,
ago.
I think that's,
Right.
I think that's the first stop, because they are the body with the first opportunity and the immediate chance to fix the issue before you have to get into anything else. I mean, that's,
Brian?
I have two questions for the board members. Wondering if you'd be willing to state publicly your position on the Rose Bay project, and then secondly, maybe share other proposals for the land that you've seen.
Other proposals for the land?
The 30 Pound Street. We've only seen one.
Oh, I haven't seen any others.
Me either. That doesn't seem fair.
I haven't seen others either. I mean, obviously, I've stated publicly I'm in favor of the project, and, you know, if this issue is resolved and cleared up, I think on the substance and on the merits, it's still a good project. And now, maybe that somebody else bids and outbids Mr. McMillan if you redo that somehow, and it's somebody else. But I mean, you have to be prepared, it could be somebody who wants to do something bigger there as well.
Maybe it's something that would require 18 acres versus 8.
I don't know what it would be.
They don't,
There's not 18 acres there, so if it required 18 acres, it
does-
would go someplace else.
it does not work on the basis of the land available. It has to do with the project itself and the units, whether it fits on a particular site and whether it's some government agency's interpretation that it fits on the site may not comport with your interpretation. I've been involved with a number of these and proposals in Franklin, where I've been town attorney for 18 years. And frankly, at the moment at least, there aren't a lot of developers out there that do this type of thing to begin with. They're all dependent on federal and state subsidizing programs, and it takes years for those to fall into place. So, you know, hypothetically, even if it gets rebid, you may end up exactly back where you are right now.
You want to answer Brian's question?
So I'm in favor of having elderly housing at that site. I think I already said that when I first learned of this and the size and scope of it, that I called Mr. McMillan and asked him to make it 2 stories. Would he please make it 2 stories tall? And that would make it a lot more palatable. I asked about the number of units, and I think I was told in that conversation also that it was important for the financial viability of it, that it be 45. To me, it makes it a difficult choice for the ZBA, because it's clearly an unpalatable size for that site for the neighbors. But, you know, it's not my call to make that, you know, I haven't really figured out whether if I was on the ZBA, I would vote for that, yes or no.
And to be clear, again, what Deidre started, her first comment was that we're in favor of there being senior housing on that.
Yeah, every comment about this project and that site starts with that phrase.
It's true. And there's been some things written and said about some of the neighbors that we're a not in our backyard group, and that's not the case at all. I just think the public record needs to show that.
So my thinking has evolved over time, and what I would do if I had total control of that site is I would level Tilden, and I would build a whole new development.
So all the neighbors agree, and we fear that there will be another 45 units next, is because we've already been told by the zoning board that Tilden is not adequate, and we don't believe that the neighbors that are currently in there will get moved over to the new.
I mean, it drives me crazy that Tilden has electric heat, which is just hugely inefficient and wasteful. And when we're trying to be net zero by 2050 in this state, you know, that doesn't help at all. They have trouble renting the second floors because the elderly people can't get to the second floors up the stairs because there are no elevators. I mean, you need a building that has an elevator for a cohort of people that are this age and have the disabilities that they do. But I don't know that it needs to be a 3-story building. I mean, one of my solutions for Mr. McMillan was to make it 2 stories, but just cover more of the site, the lot. I mean, I think that might have made it worse for you guys, but at least it wouldn't be 3 stories with that type of mass.
In my business.
Just get your microphone. There you go.
That lets the people at home hear you.
In my business, the reason you put an RFP out is you put a specification for what you're desiring, and if it were 2 stories that you were desiring, that would be part of the RFP process, that you would specify that as desirable. And then you would get bids, and that whole process that never seemed to happen as part of this. I mean, again, nobody wants to go back to square one, but one could understand why that might be beneficial, and even the concept of using Tilden Village property as well in the RFP and looking at it more broadly. Just interesting that that did not happen.
So to complete the round of personal views, the first thing, because of what you had sent, Deidre, I sent you the information about the July 31st meeting, but I did really go through the whole thing, and I was pleasantly surprised. If you really want to know what my personal view on this is, if you go back to that video, I was pleasantly surprised to realize that my thinking had not drifted since last July. Right now, as this particular issue is shaping up at this stage, and actually right now, I don't think this is even the conversations that's on the table, because there's a prerequisite conversation on the table around legality. So part of me says, this is a nice discussion for us to have. At this point, right now, it's irrelevant, because the prerequisite is the legality. So it doesn't matter. But the way this discussion around the project, if it's to go, is shaping up, it is one of those painful decisions that I guess the selectmen more than anybody else face in having to make between a desire to provide senior housing in a place that a lot of seniors would like it, in accordance with an intent that's been around for over a decade at least, or to listen to the concerns of the people who live in the neighborhood, who don't have high confidence that this project as envisioned is going to be a net positive. And neither of those considerations is automatically secondary to the other. So it's shaping up to be a trade-off decision as we've discussed it so far. Brian, you and I have talked a couple times, and every time we talk, I continue to think about it. I have thoughts that go beyond everything that I said on July 31st. I don't see any point to sharing any of them until we fix this legal prerequisite or answer the legal question. So, which doesn't give you the clear answer you want. It only tells you, and I think this is true of all of us, even if we come out on different sides of the coin. I don't think any of us take the concerns of citizens in a neighborhood lightly. Sometimes you're faced with the question that says, well, either you let people have what they want, or you push because you're trying to accomplish something else. You can go back through the senior housing projects, the limited number of senior housing projects that have come before the board, at least in the couple of years I've been here, and every one of them there's been an eloquent argument about why we shouldn't do it. And at this point, we don't have any senior housing projects going up because there's always an argument for it. On the other hand, that says we've been listening to those arguments all the way through. So if you want to hear what I think, go back to the July 31st video and you'll get it in excruciating detail. I think that at this stage in this conversation, we have to get past the legal questions before it's even worth putting a lot of time and effort into.
And the reason we have to get past that is because everyone will be on the same page. The process has to be legitimate. Agreed?
Of course.
Of course, okay.
That's why it's a prerequisite,
And so I think our hope this evening would the board would say, okay, the process has to be legitimate. We all agree with that. What can we do to help that? In writing a letter to the MHA to have them look into what could be their own misdoings is interesting to me, but if that's what you guys are willing to do, then that's what we'll have to.
I think my view, at least, is based on the advice we've gotten, is that that's what we do. The only issue, and Mark, I'll take your advice on the wording. You mentioned encourage. I think I would use ask rather than mild encouragement. And I think we would ask or encourage two things. One, that the MHA, this is me thinking out loud, so weigh in. That letter would ask MHA to do two things. One, provide us with confirmation from the state that the 30B transaction process contemplated, it's different, but just get confirmation that that in fact is something that is acceptable to the state. And two, get confirmation, independent confirmation, that the contracting process was properly carried out.
Does the board have the ability to hit the pause button so we're not spending more resources going to ZBA meetings and having stormwater things done and having our own research done on their reports without knowing if this is a legit process or not?
I would think we would copy the ZBA and then let them use their judgment.
You can't weigh in on the ZBA process.
That's a
There's
ZBA
a time
decision.
frame for the ZBA to act unless the developer consents to an extension.
Or else it's granted as deemed to be approved.
And understand that they have taken this on, subject to the town being in safe harbor anyway. So that's already, the developers on notice that the town's at safe harbor, they're not compelled to approve this project. But they can approve it if they determine it's in the town's interest.
So do we know the time frame the ZBA, in other words, will the MHA, if we sent that letter, does the MHA have the time to respond to that question before the ZBA hits a deadline that they need to call?
I don't know what their deadline process is right now, where they are in that timeline.
I do.
Okay,
Brian McMillan requested an extension at the ZBA's urging.
okay.
So I would say
How far,
it was mid-February was the original timeline. and
Okay.
Yeah, I knew you
60-day
requested the extension, I just wasn't sure how long they had.
I think
they
60-day
granted it.
so
extension.
we're out into April?
So we're out
based on
into
that.
April, but he actually requested a continuance for the last meeting that was supposed to be held. So
Deirdre,
raises
was-
the question of whether there will be another 30-day extension.
Okay.
Don't know.
Deirdre, was that extension to deal with this issue?
No, the extension was because of previous continuances having to do with design and other issues that Brian McMillan needed more time to consider.
There's a lot of, I think in this whole process, my limited observation is there's a lot of people who are trying to figure out how to steer this process to get to a solution which is acceptable or more acceptable to the neighbors that still works. And what I don't know, because I'm not a real estate developer, is whether those are two mutually exclusive solution sets or whether there's a point of intersection. And I don't know.
I don't know either, and I actually don't want to get into the merits of the project tonight. It's not
Thank
my
you.
personal purpose for being here. But I just would like to make one thing clear on this whole RFP issue and the legal issues that has surfaced as a result, which is this is not some kind of gotcha exercise by the neighbors to find a way to kill this project. The reason that it even surfaced at all was because we were told repeatedly about this RFP, an RFP for 40 to 60 units. This is the only thing that could be built here. It's the only thing that could be viable. It has to be 45 units. And so, being a lawyer who has filed public records requests in other areas during my career, I thought, well, gee, I'd really like to know if they issue this RFP, what other responses they got. Were there other projects that were put on the table that then, they chose the Newgate proposal for the 45 units? So I submitted public records requests to the state and to the Medfield Housing Authority. And that's when all these issues started to come forward, when I got the actual and only RFP that they issued. And being a lawyer, I had serious concerns, which I've already explained. So this was serendipitous. This was not the neighbors trying to find a way, a legal technicality, to make this project not happen. We are in favor of affordable senior housing on this site, but we would like to see a project that we feel is reasonable and consistent with the scale of the neighborhood. So I just wanted to clarify that.
And what do you think that is?
Pardon?
What do you think that is?
I think it's more like 25 units. That's just my personal
You
opinion.
got Jim behind you that wanted to talk.
I just wanted, Jim Sujanin, 10 Sanders Way. I just wanted to make the point that, Mr. Murby, you had made the comment that none of us was in favor of this project as it stands, and I wanted to point out that I disagree with you.
I know there's some in your neighborhood that are, but
So,
not the
yeah,
majority, don't
I think that, you know, I serve this country. I made a lot of sacrifices to serve this country, and I believe in the processes that take place in this country, following the law and making sure things happen in a proper way. If this is the proposal, if Rose Bay is the proposal that we ended up with after a legitimate process, and this is what we have to deal with, it's okay. I'm okay with that. But the process that's gone on, it was done under the board to some degree. I mean, yes, it was done legally, but it wasn't done openly in good faith. So I've had a problem with the process. We've ended up with this proposal, and it wasn't done properly. I mean, but if it had been done properly, and we had this 45-unit thing, and this is everything had been bid, and this is what we were ended up with as the best thing, the best solution for the town, I'll suck it up. I'll take one for the team, take one for the town. I'm happy to do that, but I have problems when processes aren't followed, whether it's by good intention or bad intention. I don't know. The process wasn't followed properly. It's quite clear. And it does need to be clarified. I'm glad that the selectmen are going to take some initiative to try to clarify the process. And it may have been done properly. I don't know. I hope that we do get clarification on it. I hope that the Housing Authority is open to trying to resolve this problem, because it's going to make all of our lives a lot easier if it does. So those are my comments.
You're going to have a comment in the back, but just a quick response. First off, I completely agree with your sentiment, so you'll see no argument from me. I think this is just me speaking, but again, I think maybe my two colleagues here would agree. There's legal, there's proper, and there's perfect. And so right now we're asking a question, is it legal? Sitting here as a selectman trying to get things through the town, there's a big gap between, yes, it's legal, and yes, people are satisfied that the process heard them out, even if they don't get what they want. That's another zone. We're not in that zone right now. We're just trying to get past the legal step. I would hope, I actually think up till now, we've been trying to improve, even if it was a little after the fact, that moving from bare minimum legal to full bore, everybody understands and accepts proper. I think we will get back to that. I'm not exactly sure how quick.
Candace Avery, Director for the Medfield
Thanks for
Housing
showing up,
Authority.
Candace.
You're welcome. I actually am just coming, and I wanted to hear everybody's concerns, as the Housing Authority has wanted to hear all across the boards. And we have been working diligently to make sure that our process has been transparent, legal, forthright. I think everybody has an interpretation of what that is, and I hope that we can answer all concerns, and that's what we're working for. The attorneys involved, and why I'm here tonight, are working towards putting out a statement on behalf of the Housing Authority and answering any questions and concerns posed. The request for documents that was sent from the Hill Group was actually not received by us until yesterday. So we are issuing the request for some additional time just to answer those questions. We weren't trying not to answer them or be evasive. We just didn't receive them. So I had received the email on Friday. We actually received the paperwork on Monday, and we will be responding. So I don't want for anyone to think that the Housing Authority is not proactively here to respond. We absolutely are. And I appreciate all of the concerns that are being voiced, and the Housing Authority is listening to all of them, as is Newgate. And we're hopeful that we'll be able to get through all of this to be able to create these affordable units for our elderly population. That is the goal, and we'll work towards getting there with everybody who's involved.
Candace, not to squeeze you, but if your lawyers are already writing that statement, I think, I don't know if you came in when we were talking about sending a letter to MHA.
Yep.
There were so you heard that, two questions. One is the 30B disposition, and the other one is just the overall propriety of the contract. getting an RFP for a consulting services contract somehow or another morphed into a development contract. Is that all done, has that been done legitimately?
Yeah.
Do you have a sense, and I'm not trying to squeeze you here on time here, but this first question is, so can we dispense with the letter because you know what we want and you're already working on it?
We are. We're already
Okay.
working on it. And we're
Okay.
not at the point of disposition. The Housing Authority has not gotten there. And we're discussing a land lease, but we're not looking at disposition. However, any legality behind that will be handled with DHCD.
Can we get a
and
pro forma reading on that?
You'll receive everything from the attorneys.
Okay, and do you have a sense of the time frame that we should see that? I'm not squeezing you, I'm just trying to find out.
No, they're going to do it as soon as they possibly can.
Is that,
Weeks, months, days?
is that local council, or is that council you were using previously?
It's council we've been using previously and locally for Newgate.
So they're familiar with Massachusetts law?
They are, yes.
Do you have a ballpark? So here, I think you heard this part. Well, no, the issue is, so Newgate, I guess, is requested, we're sensitive to the ZBA deadlines. It sounds like there's been a continuance, it's gone out to the middle of April. So I'm just trying to figure out
No,
how-
they're going to respond as soon as possible. I'm hoping, I would say days,
Okay.
if
okay.
weeks,
I'm not trying to hold you to a date.
Right.
We're talking days, and let's just say sometime this month.
Right,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
We are dealing with lawyers here, Gus. We don't
Yeah,
like those specific deadlines.
Yeah, I'm a project management consultant, so I'm a little more precise on schedules. Okay. Mark, first off, has everybody had whatever it is they wanted to say, they've had a chance to say it? All right. Mark, any last words of advice for the selectmen?
So there's no misunderstanding. What would be expected here is either an opinion from the attorney, from the Inspector General's office that this project has been reviewed and proper process has been followed, or, I suppose, a very strong attorney's opinion letter on your behalf to that effect.
Agreed.
I see Brian nodding no here. Brian, when we get that, we'll deal with we'll look at that and then decide where to go next. So this is not just so you know. Okay. Yeah, Dieter? Yeah.
Just one request, I wondered if we might hear from the Medfield Housing Authority's lawyers in advance of the next ZBA hearing on the 27th, because one of the agenda items at that meeting is Attorney Hill's letter.
You absolutely will.
Okay. And with that, will you normally send that to Dieter or somebody in this group, or is it, there's a
They'll
way they're gonna get it?
They'll respond to everybody
Okay.
for full transparency, yes.
Okay.
Well, I would request that the town administration, probably Christine, if you don't mind, as a contact, receive a copy so that the town and its administration is aware of what's going on in real time, more or less.
I agree.
I think we're about to close out. I would, given that this is contentious, I would simply make the observation that I believe everybody that is a party to this discussion, Medfield Housing Authority, you all as neighbors in the Pound Street area, I even, without knowing him very well, Brian McMillan, we're trying to deal with an issue that's important to the town, which is to find senior housing. I think we're all trying to do that. Yeah, we're getting cross-threaded on it, but just let at least tonight's record of the Board of Selectmen show that there is nobody that is being viewed as not operating in good faith here, trying to figure this one out.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Candace. All right, let's see, we have, where's Russ? Is Russ
So
Halsey?
Russ is actually not going to speak tonight. I'm speaking on his behalf.
You're speaking on Russ Halsey's behalf. I needed a signature on my nomination papers. Ah, Dog.
Russ and I had a conversation, as well as Tristan, regarding the New Life Furniture 5K road race. I had said to Russ he should come in to talk to us regarding their procedures for alcohol this year. Russ and Tristan reminded me that they do not serve alcohol at the New Life 5K road race. I was confusing them with another road race. So Building and Grounds has already approved it, and this is the annual run. They are expecting 100 extra runners this year, but police chief had no issue with it.
Okay. Will they come back in for, do we have to do anything on a consent?
I would just like you to, just to approve, they're gonna run the
Just-
road race
yeah.
at the hospital as recommended by Building and Grounds.
Okay,
So moved.
Second.
all those in favor?
Yep.
Aye.
Good.
Thank you.
Okay. Next, Dean
More
Minio.
lawyers, Gus.
Yes, yes, more lawyers. Okay, discussion of the cultural center lease. Hey, Steve, good to see you.
Oh, but you gotta pick up the microphone if you're gonna sit there.
So thanks for the opportunity to come back and continue the conversation about the lease. I'm here with Bob Tormey, if he's still here. Vicky Sheps, who's been doing a ton of work along with Mark Sorrell on getting the lease to where it is so far. Unfortunately, is home with pneumonia, so she sends her regrets. But we do have Steve Nolan, and we're so grateful that he's here and for his time today to help us with this. I assume that you've all seen the latest draft with some additional proposed language in that. What I've come to understand, excuse me, in my conversations with Steve, we've talked in the past about making sure the lease is something that wouldn't inhibit donors. What I've come to appreciate with Steve is that this lease is going to get far more scrutiny from our future investors and lenders. So tonight I have 3 goals to come out of this meeting, which I hope we can get to all of them. The first is to answer any questions that you all might have about this framework and the structure around the historic tax credits and what that might, what that looks like in terms of moving forward through the lease process. I'd also like to talk about the lease language itself, if we can get to agreement about how we proceed with that. And then third, I'd like to get some clarity on what our next steps are to put this thing to bed. So I was going to propose that Steve take a few minutes to talk about sort of the process of the historic tax credits and the structure legally and what that would look like, unless you all have some questions you would like him to address first up front, or have a different proposal for how to proceed through the conversation.
I'm okay letting Steve start.
Okay. Thanks, Steve.
Actually, because this stuff is pretty complicated, I actually put together a little bit of a diagram, because I have a hard time talking about this without a picture. And I think most people have a hard time understanding without a picture. I think you may have a couple there, so.
Yep.
So what I put together is two pictures here. The first one is a pretty standard historic tax credit structure. Just to highlight a couple of features. So the historic tax credit is a credit that can only be claimed by an entity that pays taxes. So the initial tenant under the lease we've all talked about is being Cultural Alliance of Medfield, which is a nonprofit, which is fine for this interim period while there's a lot of planning going on and other activities to get ready for an actual groundbreaking and financing closing as soon as possible. But at the time when the project's ready to go into construction, an investor will have to be admitted who can actually take advantage of the tax credit. The tax credit, a credit against your federal taxes. CAM as a nonprofit doesn't have any federal taxes, so the investor comes in and basically puts equity into the project in exchange for the tax credits. So in the most simple version I have here, the real estate is owned by the town. Town ground leases it to CAM initially, but it would at some point need to be assigned to a limited liability company that could admit the investor. CAM steps into the role of being the managing member of that entity, so CAM retains control of the entity, but the investor member comes in and gets a 99.99% equity interest as a investor member, thereby allowing them to earn all the tax credits and put tax credit equity into the project. So that's sort of the most basic structure, but again requires a project LLC. So at some point the lease would and the structure have to be assigned to that LLC, and CAM would be in a controlling position, but actually wouldn't be the direct tenant. The second chart is a little more complicated, but I put it in because in the historic tax credit investment market, there are sort of two prevailing structures, one being the simple one I just described, the other being a master lease structure, which has certain tax attributes that are preferable to a number of investors. So it's possible an investor would come and say, we'll put the tax credit equity in, but we want to use what's called a master lease pass-through structure. Under this structure, the three initial building blocks look the same. The real estate is owned by the town leases it to CAM. It likely have to be a project LLC here as well, controlled by CAM, but then there will be a sublease, which is called a master lease for 32 years, which includes with it a pass-through election, which is a kind of technical tax concept, but it's the one instance here where this tax credit can actually be transferred. It can be passed to a master tenant entity. The investor then invests in that entity instead and claims the credit. And CAM would actually be the managing member of both of these entities, so they would be in a controlling position both as to the project LLC and as to the master tenant. So it's a slight nuance on the other structure, but I just, in the interest of trying to explain fully all the twists and turns that could happen, I wanted to make sure I presented this alternative structure because there are some investors who would insist on using this structure rather than the simple structure.
And Steve, the difference is that under the first one, that investor that's benefiting the most is actually taking over the property, whereas in this master lease, they're technically a tenant renting the property from CAM?
Yeah, I mean, under neither circumstance do I really consider that the investor's taking over. What it really is the investor is purchasing the equity interest in the property. So it's like being a silent investor. So CAM would run the show, and for all intents and purposes, if you were a third party, you'd think that CAM was operating this, but the investor will be behind the scenes claiming all the tax benefits. And you're right, and the other alternative, the investor is sort of one step more removed. They are putting the equity into the master tenant. Master tenant then usually does a loan into the project of the equity. So it makes it's more complicated. It's sort of the same, when you boil it down, but they're more one step removed from actual investment in the project LLC. So.
That's because they get some kind of return on the loan on top of the.
Well, there's better treatment in the historic tax credit world. You basically at the end of the 5-year credit period, usually the investor exits the structure. Under the master lease, there's a better treatment of the tax consequence of exiting. So I could get into it, but
that's about as much as I'm going to grasp. Yes.
So kind of to cut to the chase, I'll give you the context from my standpoint. You have a derelict building or buildings up there, not unlike the Dwight Derby House, and in some loose sets, and it needs work to be able to become productive. And there's a group willing to take it over and make it productive. And so I guess my concern is, what assurances does the town have that once this process starts, that it will produce those results and you won't end up with a project somewhere short of complete or short of functional, and the town's left with it in that state?
So just from my perspective, so I took a look at the lease really thinking, is it financeable from two perspectives? One is, could you close a mortgage loan with a senior lender, and could you close on an equity investment, which are two likely sources of money, and then there'll be contributions and other things as well. I describe that as being the point at which you're ready to break ground, and that's the point when most of these concepts really kick in, because before that it's just going to be CAM, and at that point you need to bring in the third parties that are going to really scrutinize the lease and make sure that they feel protected. In the period between today and getting there, the town can have all sorts of checks and points of intervention to make sure that the progress is adequate, and it's basically CAM's risk at that point that they don't get to that finish line, or that the lease is terminated because they haven't done everything they're supposed to do before they reach that point. from my perspective, once they reach that point where the building is going into the ground and all these people are starting to put money into it, it has to be a pretty ironclad lease, because otherwise they're not going to bring their money to the table. So, but before that time, it's kind of like it's CAM and the town making sure that CAM's making adequate progress in doing what the town wants on a timeline that you find acceptable. So that to me is a negotiation that Gene knows more than I do about, what those milestones would be. And only at the point when the third parties come in, and at that point I think your concern is largely gone, because all the money's on the table to do the project, the plans are approved, and things are ready to roll. It's that period before then where the greatest anxiety is.
It is and it isn't, because, yes, that addresses the improvements that need to be made, et cetera, but then you've got a cultural and artistic facility that's proposed, and I assume it's going to have to generate a certain level of revenue to handle its ongoing expenses. And what assurances does the town or anybody, the third-party investors for that matter, have that's going to work, as opposed to that, for whatever reason, just doesn't work out? And I mean, we all know, frankly, that that's very challenging, and it's on an ongoing basis to make that work.
Well, typically, I mean, I've done a lot of historic tax credit projects, both with for-profit developers and also with nonprofits. And the nonprofits, that is one of the challenges of convincing the investor and whatever lender you have to put their money in the project, because they have the same kind of underwriting issues that you would expect, where they want to know that the project will operate and generate enough revenue so that it can pay its debt, and that it'll stay in operation long enough for the investor. That's only 5 years, so that's a pretty short horizon. Usually the debt is the bigger issue, because the debt will stretch out to 20 years or 30 years, who knows what the terms of that might be. So the lenders probably kick the tires the hardest on that, but they're going to look for a track record of seeing the operations of CAM and up until that point, and the ability to raise money in case there's a shortfall. And also they'll do a market study and see what is the demand for the facility. I know Gene's already done some market studies, trying to prove out that there is a demand for this and it can generate sufficient revenue. But the lenders are going to look pretty hard at that as well, because they are going to lose a lot of money. So, I mean, I think there'll be an alignment that way. But of course, there are no guarantees. I mean, it could be that everything looks great on paper and all projects out and it operates for 10 years and then it fails. I mean, that's not beyond the realm of possibility, and I don't know that there's any real way to give anybody a guarantee that that's going to happen. I think once you have a facility like this that's sort of a showpiece for the town, it's likely to generate a lot of support, and a lot of people will be interested in making sure it does succeed. But it wouldn't be the first facility that had failed, I
So
guess.
looking at the worst-case scenario, let's take that hypothetical 10 years out, it fails. What happens at that point legally? What's the consequences of that?
Well, so there's a couple possibilities. I mean, I'm guessing at that point the investor will likely be gone, so you really be talking about a lender, a senior lender. I'm also assuming that in all likelihood the facility, that CAM will try to pay off its debt as soon as possible, but it'll be some period of time before that actually happens. So at that point you can run into a situation where you have a foreclosure by the lender, that being sort of the worst case scenario from CAM's point of view, and probably from the town's as well. The one thing in that case is that you try to build into the lease certain protections about who can operate and what the uses are that they can do, so that the successor, if there is one, number one, might be controlled by a nonprofit. That always makes it a little harder to get the financing, but towns typically do that because they want to make sure that they have a nonprofit operating this in a way that's beneficial to the town as much as possible. But then they also will restrict the uses so that it's limited to the things and that also diminishes the value to some extent, because the lender says, well, then I'm going to have to find TCAN or some other organization around to operate this when CAM has failed. So it does, the lenders usually push to have the uses as broad as possible, because then there's more of a possibility of finding a successor that can keep operating it. But ultimately, that's kind of the tug and pull. The town wants to know that this is going to look something like a cultural center run by a nonprofit, whether it's CAM or some successor that the bank might find. And then the other possibility is CAM just closes up shop. They've paid off their debt, or the bank writes off the debt or whatever, and it just sits there. The town would regain control of it and presumably do something else with it.
So if I'm following the risk, I think where you were coming from is, I'm trying to understand the risk for the town. It sounds like the risk of the town is most likely, if there was one, would be the building, the investment money would have come in, the building would have been renovated, it would have been brought up and running, the programs would be carrying out, and after 10 years, it doesn't hold itself up and it collapses. If the lender were to foreclose, the building is not put up as collateral on the loan because it's a lease, right?
Well, but
that
it'll be
work?
the use of the building.
The use of the building,
for the
yeah.
remaining
Lease would be
term.
the lender has a chance to come in and perform under the lease if it wanted.
That's, basically what we're saying there is we have a renovated building. It would, I don't want to depress you on all this dark scenario here, Jim. Have a renovated building that ran for some number of years, and then that didn't work out. The lender comes in, forecloses on the loan and says, well, I want the rest of the lease, and I'm going to use it for vaudeville shows or whatever they choose to do. We would probably have to endure that as the Northeast Bawdy House of Massachusetts for the life of the lease, at the end of which time we would regain control of a seedy-looking but renovated chapel. Okay.
Well, we actually had this analogy with the Kingsbury Club, which has levels of lending behind him. It was an SBA loan. And so we knew that up front. So there was very strong language. It basically said that if there was a default by Kingsbury Club, the lenders and their successors and the signs would have no greater ability than whatever the Kingsbury Club had in the first place.
Right.
And on some refinancing attempts, there was definitely pushback attempts to get us to change that language, and basically, the town took a strong position, as you indicated a minute ago, so I guess it's not dissimilar here.
Right. I mean, that will be the test, in my opinion, is when you get to that point that the lender starts saying, I'm not comfortable financing this because the uses, if I take over, are too narrow, or the constraints on me are too severe. That's a possible conversation. I mean, our job will then be to try and convince the lender it's not that big a deal, but ultimately there may be some pushback. So, but
I think from the town's perspective, our risk is in the pre-financing period. I think the downside, once they've actually gotten the money, gotten the investor, and renovated the building, our downside is limited.
Yeah.
And so I think whatever milestones we put in there would be in that financing period, and I think I would be comfortable with some period of time where, I don't know what it would be, where we'd have a check-in, and then we'd have to decide whether we'd have an option to terminate, whether it's after 5 years or 7 years or whatever else it would be, to say, all right, if we haven't made any progress, we'd have an option to terminate at that point or extend or what have you. I'd rather have it be simpler. I mean, you have it in the addendum, sort of these three different or four different, yeah, there's 2, 3, but there's 4 different stages, and I guess my preference would be pre-financing and post-financing, and to leave it relatively straightforward, that for a period of time before you have financed and begun renovations, because I think construction would happen after you financed. And
Correct.
presumably, you're not going to start construction only 40% of the way there financially. And so that was my thought in looking at the stages of lease in the addendum and looking at what you were trying to accomplish with the additional language, that I think if you drew a bright line, and we just have to define what that meant in terms of financing and pre-financing and post-financing, I think that's probably, from my standpoint, sufficient to protect the town. And then I think the question would be just when would that kick in? Would it be, 5 years was my initial reaction, just because it's a round number. I mean, it could be 3, it could be 7, it could whatever, right? So.
And I would say, in my experience, that's typical. I mean, I think there were other steps put in to try and assuage the town that progress was being made. But in my experience, usually it's that key issue is that you've got approved plans and specs, you've got your financing line up, and you're ready to go into construction. Then everybody breathes a sigh of relief that you got there. But any time before that, you have to reach that within the deadline or an extension if everybody everybody feels like you're making adequate progress. So, I mean, Gene, I don't know what that timeline is. I mean, typically we'd want it as far out as possible, given how much investment's going to go into this at that point. And then you could also say, well, it'll be this much, but we'll give you up to 2 or 3 extensions of a year each if we feel like you're making adequate progress. So we can feel like, we're 80% of the way there. We didn't quite make it.
Yeah, if you wanted to give yourself sort of an automatic extension after 5 years on hitting some milestone so that the town can't pull the rug out from under you, if you're close at that point, that would be fine too. I think at some point it's got to be within the discretion of the board to decide, okay, we've gone far enough with this and we need to stop it. But I'm sensitive to that concern as well. You don't want to be in a situation where you're almost there and then someone decides, okay, fine, we're gonna stop it. And I think also, I don't think we want this to be a subject of perpetual renegotiation, argument, and debate every 2 years or every year or every 18 months. I mean, I think towns decided to do this, the state has authorized it. I know we had that one issue to clear up about the scope of the state's approval. And so I think within reason, my view would be make it simple and give you as much time as you need.
I'm basically on board with that same idea, that I just think we need those guideposts, and I think that getting to the financing is the big thing. I actually, this is the sort of thing that I do know something about, so I went through it, I got the lease this afternoon and did read it, and I made a couple comments, so I can just share those with you. I'll email them to you guys.
Okay.
You want to copy me on that too, Pete?
Absolutely.
Please.
Yeah.
Different question, you don't have to answer it now, but at some point, I'd appreciate hearing it. This isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening with a surrounding context of buildings, and it would, at some point, when you're in a position to, I would be curious to know your perspective on the timing of what should happen all around this thing in order to not make financing harder. I guess as if you were looking for financing right now, it'd be pretty hard. We're working to move ahead, but there's 2 scenarios. One, we move ahead, and another one is we get a plan and then it doesn't make it. And then I'm not exactly sure what that looks like, but it's probably a little more barren site than what we envisioned as we're going down this path. So having some sense of, from a year by year timing, it would be really nice if we had this well underway by X time relative to our timetable for fundraising. It would just be useful information for me to have or I think for all of us to have in the back of our head. This is a project where I think the town's intentions are to do whatever it's prudent for the town to do to improve the chances it's going to be successful. So it's not a question you got to prove it to us. It's the matter of, can we make this, can we shade the odds in the best way possible?
Do you have any thoughts around the financing piece or with the rest of the development?
I mean, not specifically. I think it has to be a little bit open-ended, just because what it means to me is that we've gotten plans and specs for the renovation that are ready to go. We've got a construction contract signed up, and we've got all the financing in place to pay for that cost. So that's what I typically see. I mean, it's hard to drill down too much because it'll morph a little bit as the design happens, and and other factors come in, and the pro forma may shift depending on what that looks like. So I agree with Mike that it's good to have that deadline. What it exactly looks like, I mean, I think it's also helpful for, I think, probably from both sides to actually have some sense of what the game plan is getting to that deadline. But I think the deadline is really sort of the hard thing. But I think you'll know it when you see it, in the sense that we really will have an approved set of plans, a contract, and financing that's sufficient to pay for the rehab. That to me is,
Actually, I was asking a different question. I was really saying, right now we have a development committee that's moving ahead given the approval of the zoning changes
Right.
last fall. We have a development committee that's moving ahead. The formal schedule for that is that we would go through an RFQ sometime in the first half of the year, issue an RFP sometime in the second half of the year, probably be in a position to, assuming we find a proper, attractive developer, at the earliest, we would be talking about approving that a year from this year's annual town meeting. Given our track record for getting things done on a timely basis, my guess is that we're at least.
I know
on to
nothing
next
about
fall.
that.
Yeah, so what I'm getting at is, okay, there's a 2-year window on that,
Right.
probably best case. I don't know where that fork in the road, which fork we're gonna take, and I don't know how much that would stretch out. If you suddenly said, gee, if you guys take more than 5 years to get your act together on the rest of this site, and it remains a big question mark, that then starts to become an anchor on our effort to try to get this thing up and going. So I'm just looking for that kind of a
I mean, I don't know,
broad
Gene,
picture.
whether you have a feel, I mean, I think
I guess it's
this.
5 years, but I don't know.
Right. I mean, it would be great because I think there'll be a synergy to having both going at once. I don't get the sense that you would abandon ship if the rest of the development was slower than that. I mean,
No, and depending on the timing, I mean, we had already talked about an alternative for infrastructure if it wasn't in place in time.
Right.
Or if a developer, if the whole thing falls apart, looking at a plan B just to get going. Ideally, a developer would be on board. There'd be more, like you said, a synergy. There'd be infrastructure in place for us.
Oh, I'm thinking, yeah, well, that's a piece of it, but I'm even thinking of the investors you're trying to attract. There's one picture that says, oh, we're renovating a chapel in the middle of this vibrant, newly developed community versus, oh, we're renovating a chapel and the hazmat folks are coming down the next building over. It's a little different picture. So my guess is that would translate in the calculation of what the investment was worth or what the
Which
risk
I
is.
still think is 4 or 5 years out anyway.
Okay.
Optimistically.
So we should know which fork in the road we're taking by that time, I would think. So,
Or we'll all be gone.
except for Jean, she's got to see this thing through.
So that's the process. Are there any questions on the actual proposed additional language? Sounds like you had some minor things, Pete, that you'll get to us.
There were just some language choices. There were
Okay.
3. I was inserting, you had rights in the rest of the campus, and I just was defining that by public accessible parts of the campus. So that if
Yeah,
the
and
developer
one thing
says
in
you
our
can't-
conversation, we were meeting beforehand about this, and one thing I think we need to look at the lease again is to make sure that we're sort of like a little island in the middle of this pretty big property, and that we have rights to cross it. Similar to the whole debate we had about the boat launches, that could get rerouted depending on what the town decides on the rest of the site, but we would need somehow to have an access road that comes up and somehow a way to get our utilities in. Again, that could be rerouted if that is necessary. But so those things I don't think were spelled out that clearly in the lease, so we might need to add those
I
just to
think
make sure.
there's also gonna be a need to use other property for parking.
And parking was the third.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I have a question, but you and I can talk about parking and maintenance and snow plowing and all that. And
Right.
I have a draft from the county of some lot lines, but we can talk about exactly how that will work. They can move that, expand or contract depending on what you're looking for.
So just to understand, Steve, I had met with Vicky Sheps back around the holidays and went over some proposed revisions. And then I never got a separate document on that. I ended up getting this. So is this a joint effort, or did you do all of this? Did you just give her sections, or what? So
I think
understand.
that is mostly, I mean, when Gene gave it to me, he said, we're heading down this road, and can you look at this for a financing tax credit, et cetera? So some of that sort of strayed into other areas, but I just put on my hat of a lender's attorney or an investor's attorney looking at this lease and what they would look for. So I think most of what you have there came from me. So I'm guessing that if there were more comments between you and Vicky, they may not be reflected in that.
Okay. Has she gone through this?
She
No.
has, and she was fine with it.
So it sounds like we're good.
Next steps?
I mean, from my perspective, I think to deal with whatever comments you got from Pete and Christine and Mark on the lease, pick a number for the, it sounds like we're flexible within reason and Steve, if you want to define that trigger, I think the 3 components that make sense to me. And just define how that will work and what that date is and what the number is and.
And now, based on your comments, I need to go back and look at my notes from meeting with Vicky and compare that with this. I had a sense that they'd been addressed, but it might have just been coincidentally that you
Well, I
revised.
know we did exchange some emails, so it may be that Vicky had said some things to me that I built in. It's something a little
Because a
fuzzy
lot of
now.
my issues were basically not so much what are the landmarks, but what are the preconditions to going forward, which was namely the selectmen having the ability to review for both acceptability and financial viability, and it looks like that was incorporated in there as some changes, so.
And Christine, your comment about the county lines, does that address the issue of specifying the boundary? Is that,
That's what
that's
they're
the same
working
thing?
on.
Okay,
Right.
Thank you.
good, thank you.
Steve,
Good
can
to
I
see you,
just give
Steve. All right, let's see, it's getting easier. Action items. Maurice Goulet, DPW Director, requests the Board of Selectmen to vote to accept the SSERG Award for DPW Services for February 1st, 2020 to January 31st, 2021.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye, okay, approved. Next, Selectmen are requested to vote to sign the March 3rd, 2020 warrant for the presidential primary.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Yep.
Aye.
Can we specify that the votes have to be counted on that same night? in the town
No.
of Medfield?
Not by now.
A 2-hour window for reading the read.
We have an app, for it, don't worry.
In light of our new town clerk situation, didn't get much sleep last night.
Trust us. I'll tell you what the name of it is, who did it, but we have it. Okay. Let's see, next. Anything about the capital budget that we need to talk about?
We've given you a new updated budget. The way the schedule's worked out, we've been presenting our new budget worksheet to the warrant committee, and then the following night presenting it to you. You're both meeting in the same week. Nick has produced a summary spreadsheet to let you know what's changed since the last one. The major change in this is the financial team met with Sharon last week, and we discussed meeting the reserve policy. And the warrant committee and the financial team have both expressed to the Board of Selectmen that that is the most imperative thing that we do this year, and that is the first thing we need to do. So instead of, the first draft of the budget I gave you had using $500,000 in free cash, which meant that we were trying to then stretch to meet the reserve policy. We've reframed that, and we're starting with the reserve policy first. And Nick can give you some updates at the end of the meeting with that.
So the 1.23 million is 700 that you told us about before, plus the 500.
Plus the 500, they also asked us to include some estimates for cost of living. We're trying to put everything in there that we know as of now. There are still some unknowns, and we won't find out till the end of February what our increases are for health insurance. So we're still carrying a 7% on that.
Okay.
We've got some estimates on collective bargaining agreements, but we can't put the full amounts in there. So we still have some what-ifs in here, but we're starting to develop the what-if scenario for the actual town meeting.
Okay.
And we should have a better idea of those at the meeting on the 18th. And we'll start to develop 4 different scenarios of how we see this going forward.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Second item then is annual town meeting warrant articles.
So we're gonna close, the annual town meeting the warrant will close at your next meeting on February 18th. So if anybody has any warrant articles that they are looking for, I have a draft list going now.
You do have drafts?
I have
Because I got asked that question on Facebook, you may know, and it was like I said, we're not closing it today, but the only reason I said that is I haven't seen any articles, so either.
No, I have a draft list. I'm holding some placeholders, both for the Energy Committee and the Mass Historic, the District Committee.
Okay.
Are holding placeholders. Other than that, I have not received any citizens petitions, and I have not received any other committee articles other than from the planning board.
Okay, so you'll send that draft list out to us?
Soon as I have it, yep.
Prior to the
Prior
next
to the meeting.
meeting, so we'll have some sense of what's there.
Yes, I'm hoping to present it next Monday at the warrant committee.
Okay. And then just closely related to that, is the Energy Committee coming in next meeting? When do we expect?
They
them
are
to
not
come
going to be able to come in until the first meeting in March. So I will hold placeholders for them,
Okay.
and they'll come in the first meeting in March, I believe.
in? Okay.
I think it was the
It
4th.
still look like for placeholders, you're still holding 4?
I'm holding 4 placeholders, and then they'll let me know what they're moving forward with.
It's very likely to just be 2,
Okay,
Okay,
the energy manager and the goals.
okay.
okay. Well, for now,
For now, I promised Fred I'd hold them 4, so I'll hold 4 in
Okay.
case that
Okay.
does change.
two's better than 4. Okay. Let's see, MSH Development Committee, we had a meeting last week with the, actually, it was with the Energy Committee, and they brought Eversource in. They presented their ideas about trying to help figure out how to incorporate energy conservation as zero carbon type aspirational goals in the redevelopment of the state hospital. No commitments were made, no specific proposals were made. We understood that they have certain capabilities, some of which might actually sound like they could be beneficial. You know, they actually could help with some things that perhaps developers would perceive make the project more attractive. So we were probably most interested in those ideas. But at this point, I would say it was a cordial meeting, met people, heard what they could do, confirmed that we were interested in continuing the conversation, and that's about as far as that discussion went. That's all we talked about there.
So I was there too, and I guess what I would just
Maybe it was.
add, it was that I don't know what his position is at Eversource, but there's a man at Eversource who deals with this sort of stuff, and he's basically offering to assist the town in drafting the language for the RFP with respect to the energy use issues that'll make it more appealing to the developers to fulfill the highest aspirational goals.
And I think
And there's actually money for it. I mean, I think he said that there was like $3,000 per unit money available, so that the actual extra money for the developer to get to those high passive house type standards is not much of a difference from.
The tricky part is that their experience is within new construction. And so when we talk about 19th century buildings, it adds a twist that we'll have to look at closely.
And have you received any people who are interested in serving on the?
No,
I don't
but,
think we put out a request
haven't
for
put-
application.
and I'm delinquent on that.
Okay.
I need to get that to Todd. Let's see, town administrator update.
So the only thing I have tonight is I would request that the Board of Selectmen appoint Jim Mullen as the interim town clerk, and he will begin on March 4th, 2020, and serve until the next election in 2021. Jim was the town clerk in Milton for over 36 years and has also served on the Milton Board of Selectmen for over 15 years.
And he's currently serving as an interim town clerk someplace else?
He's the interim town clerk in Maynard, which is why he can't come to us before the presidential election. He'll come the day after and start working on the town election.
He served in other communities as well.
He served as an interim, I think, in over 9 different communities. He came highly recommended. Every person I reached out to, their immediate response is, get Jim. So, appears to be infamous.
All right. Motion to approve.
So moved.
I second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, that's done. Licenses and permits, consent agenda. The Souls of Medfield request permission to hold a 10K road race to take place on Sunday, June 14th, 2020. Police Chief Garrett has approved the event.
Yes, in fact, they offered to come tonight, and I told them I wasn't sure how long we would be, so I told them they didn't need to sit through all of the other things. I actually needed to apologize to them. Their request got lost. They got the police approval and then never made it back to us. We've been inundated with road race requests and just need to get a better handle on keeping up with them. But we have no issue with it. The chief has no issue with it.
When you just said that, just mark, I'm not sure how I can recover on this, but in the introduction to this meeting, I failed to mention that we're going to go into closed section at the end of this meeting. And then
It's on
that
the
we can do-
agenda.
It's on the agenda, but I
Right.
should have announced it. I skipped over it. And when you said, I'm not sure how long we're going to be, it was like, well, we're almost at the bottom of the list. I said, no, but we have a closed meeting, so,
The agenda noted when the executives, so
okay. Motion?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Yep. Aye.
Approved, okay. We have 2 minutes, right, January 7th?
You have 2. I didn't put the second one on the agenda I'm not sure why I didn't put the next,
So do we
second one,
want-
and I did send them to you, though.
Right. Do we want to, so can we approve both, or do we want to defer
I
the
think you
second
can
one?
approve both sets of minutes.
19th?
yeah, because actually, technically, legally, you're not even required to approve minutes.
Okay. But it's
Really?
so much fun.
No, you're not legally required to approve them on the agenda, but you're legally required to approve them before you.
They don't have to be approved.
I think as a
You
practice.
can't use non-approval as an excuse not to make them available on a demand, but it's
Yeah.
strictly discretionary what you do at the local level.
As a practice, I think we
You just
want
have to keep,
continue
you do have to
approve
keep them.
What?
You do have to keep them.
Oh, absolutely, you have to prepare and keep them.
But you don't actually have to.
I mean, you could have somebody who takes them swear to their accuracy.
Second one
Was
is
September?
September 19th.
Yeah, because I didn't get October too, so September.
Let's see. September 7th, excuse me. And so, January 7th, comments?
I had no comments in the 7th.
I think I had a couple edits that I sent
think you
along to
sent them
Chris.
to me, yes.
Okay. And I don't have any comments. Motion to approve?
So moved.
Second?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Yep.
Okay, and then back to the September 17th, 2019.
Move to approve.
I had some comments.
Why did I think you might?
Christine, I sent you the,
I got them today. Yep.
most of them were wordsmithing. The main section that I had comments on was the youth outreach. And what I did was I did some wordsmithing. There's one sentence that seems like it's out of sequence, so I made a comment, the part where Chelsea said that she was a licensed clinical service provider, seemed like it needed to go forward. Where it fits in the paragraph now doesn't make sense in the flow. But the sentence is fine. I added a sentence, it was in there, Mr. Murby said that he appreciated the submittal, however, what concerns him the most is that MYO offers clinical services and apparently has for a number of years. I added, specifically, he was concerned about the liability to the town that comes with providing clinical services and possible risk to the town if we do not have proper procedures in place to ensure HIPAA compliance. And I added that to kind of make more sense out of what followed that in the paragraph around HIPAA. In the next paragraph, I did some wordsmithing at the very top part. Question was raised as to what the advisory board's responsibilities would be if they are reappointed by the Board of Selectmen. That was just wordsmithing. Ms. Treeweiler noted that appointed boards committees must post meeting notices and submit minutes of the meetings. Mr. Murby then said if the advisory board wants to function as an advocacy group supporting MYO, that would be fine with him. But then there is no need for the advisory board to be appointed by the Board of Selectmen and overseen by the Board of Selectmen at all. During this discussion, Kathy Thompson chaired the advisory board. She is the chair, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I thought that was right. Pointed out that the board was not originally a Board of Selectmen appointed board, but that it became one a couple of years ago at the request of the Board of Selectmen. So some future Richard Disorder of Medfield will get a chuckle when he reviews the minutes there. And then the rest is all wordsmithing, so I've sent that to you.
I have that.
Pete, you're the one that usually cares the most on the MYO, you can have that.
That's
if you want.
fine.
That's okay.
I would move to approve the minutes as edited.
Aye, second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Yep.
Aye, okay, that's done. Yeah, your agenda said January 7th. Oh, no, it is 2020, that's right. Never mind. Next meeting dates, there is a ZBA meeting on February 12th to discuss the Chapel Hill modification. And then our next meeting is February 18th, and that's when we will close the annual town meeting warrant. The Selectmen report. Mike?
So a couple of things. We had a meeting, not an official meeting, but a meeting with a couple of the parents who are interested in building a group home for adults with intellectual disabilities in Medfield. And we're going to discuss at our next Affordable Housing Trust Board meeting an RFP that will go out seeking a kind of an agency partner in the development of such a group home in Medfield. We may get some assistance in that project from someone who is expertise in the development of group homes, so we can spell out exactly what we're looking for and how that would be structured and the rest of it. So that'll be coming along, and the next meeting of the Dale Street School Building Committee is next Wednesday. Next Wednesday, February 12th. And no update of substance. We did have a collective bargaining session with both the police and the fire department, but no update on either so far.
The Townwide Master Planning Committee met, and it's in the stage of putting together the material, and some of that was handed out and reviewed. The Energy Committee met last night, and they are, as we just mentioned, considering a couple town meeting warrant articles. There's a feeling on the Energy Committee that if the town adds a half-time position for an energy manager, that the town will make money out of it. That the DOER grants under the Green Communities Act are running at $200,000 a year. We've actually missed 2 years of grants when they were at $250,000 prior to this, because we hadn't spent all of the initial Green Communities grant of $148,000, I think it was. And you're not eligible to apply for the new grants until you've actually spent the initial grant. So other towns that got the Green Communities Act the same year that we did got those $250,000 grants for the last 2 years, and so that there's a thought that if we get this half-time person, that we could start getting those grants too. The part of the discussion was whether or not there should be the town would be interested in establishing an energy reduction goal, a carbon neutral type of goal. The state has adopted one of getting to net zero by 2050, and the question was whether or not the town might have an interest in doing that as well. The possible warrant articles are an ongoing discussion, I guess, but the other two possible articles were, one was a ban on fossil fuels, like Brookline and some other towns have passed, and that was sort of didn't engender much interest. And then the third one was exploring the issue of aggregating energy purchase for the town. And the decision on that one was pretty much to study it and to see whether or not it made any sense. The Medfield Foundation Legacy Fund Community Board met, and there was another founder that has, a couple more founders that had joined. The Legacy Fund is trying to create $1 million endowment for the town so that there will be if you have $1 million in your endowment, you get to spend $40,000 a year at a 4% spend rate, and so that you would have $40,000 of grants to give out every year. So that's the goal of the Legacy Fund. It's about a fifth of the way there now. It's got $200,000 in the bank. I went to Representative Denise Garlick's report to the town, I was fascinated by several things that she said, actually. One was how few bills there are actually at the legislature that really are controversial. It's like a handful. That there may be 3,000 or 6,000 bills, whatever it is, that get filed, but there are really very few that they actually vote on, that anybody has any real differences of opinions.
Because there's just Democrats there.
They don't all agree, apparently. And then she was talking about this new ed bill and the fact that the state's putting additional monies in. And so I asked her if she had any idea of the magnitude of the monies that were going to come Medfield's way, and she really tried to not answer that. But she did say that the discussion seemed to be that Needham might get $1 million out of it. And so that we would get, she was guessing maybe half or a quarter of that, so we'll see.
She mentioned that part of that, even though it wasn't directly going into the education, it didn't come through as a straight Chapter 70. She had put some provisions in that talked about helping to offset OPEB retirement benefits costs, so I don't know what that all means.
Health insurance, and that we would, as a town, we would benefit more from some of the new definitions in the new bill, so. Don't know the answer to that.
And Christine, I'm sure you're aware of this, but we had a presentation by the actuary in Franklin on Franklin's position on OPEB, and he was asked strategies, and apparently it's a fairly common strategy, once you get paid up with your county retirement, to take those monies, or most of them, and then divert them to OPEB sometime in the future, because I guess most municipalities will have satisfied their retirement obligations within a relatively short period of time.
You mean the surcharge, the catch-up,
Right.
the 10% that we're paying?
I had a follow-up conversation with Carol Reed, who had been at the meeting with Representative Garlick as well at the post office on Saturday, and so I combined two things. From Representative Garlick made a comment that one of the ways that they dealt with a very large 40B development, unfriendly 40B on Greeno Street in Needham, that was, I think it was 300 units. It was 50, 60 units an acre. It's the one that's been built now. You see it from Route 128 when you go down Route 128, and they got it down to apparently 134 units or something like that. And she said that one of the ways that they dealt with it and battled it was to make an argument about the microparticulate matter coming from the highway, and that they used the Board of Health, they enlisted the Board of Health to make that argument. And I was my ears perked up at that because my office in Newton is right next to the Massachusetts Turnpike. And I'd always thought it was going to be the microwave radiation that they beam over my office that was going to cook me, but apparently it's something else. And then the last thing was Gus and I both went to the MMA annual meeting, 2 days, Friday, Saturday, and I'm constantly amazed at the amount of information that I learn at that event. I went to a presentation on economic development, which was actually moderated by Medfield resident Tamara Small. I went to one on school funding. I went to one on transportation. And I learned that the scooters, the little electric scooters in Brookline are actually working. So that was interesting. The last mile, I guess, is a real problem in terms of, well, not for us. It's the first 5 miles for us. And what was the other? There was another. The last presentation was on racism, which I thought was going to be absolutely uninteresting, but it actually turned out to be incredibly interesting. Always learn stuff, always bring stuff back. Oh, and one of the things that I learned was that from the selectmen from Wellfleet was that they tax non-residents. I guess they hit them with a property tax. I don't think it's very much, but and I was thinking, gee, we've got some summer residents in Medfield. They could do that. I know of 2. Well, and then I thought a little further, and I know that Boston actually has a residential exemption, and so.
This becomes a resort town.
It's a resort town in the summer.
We're gonna have some sort of reverse tax. If you leave in the summer,
To
you
get
pay
out
more.
of town tax. For anybody who goes to their summer homes, we have a surcharge.
And that's it, Mr. Chairman.
For your vacant home in Medfield over the summer. That'll keep them here. That's good. Yes, that's good. So Pete and I, well, we had a good turnout on Friday. There were,
We had a
what,
great
6?
turnout on Friday.
6 or 7 of us. It was kind of like, it was pretty cool. More people than I've seen from Medfield at the MMA on Friday than I think I've ever seen before. We split up, so we figure out of all the things that are going on, we deliberately try to cover twice the ground. So everything Pete went to, I didn't go to. There were a few things that came out of the ones I did go to. One was the Selectmen's Association, which is now the Select Board Association. They discussed, somewhere in that discussion.
They did an official name change to Select Board.
Yeah.
Association.
They discussed boards of selectmen making presentations about the past year, so it's kind of a State of the Union type of presentation, which I think just started, right? So we'll close this out quickly so we all can go home and be prepared to do this perhaps next year. The second item, they were talking about, a couple of towns were talking about having, like in the Community Fest, which I guess would map onto maybe our Medfield Day, that they actually use that as a means of informing townspeople about town committees. So they're not necessarily recruiting, but they're letting people know. And that may be more important than you realize. I attended the last of the 3 Dale Street School Education Working Group visioning sessions just before this meeting. And in one of the exercises, I was sitting down with several of the teachers, and I got the question, what do you actually do? And so I explained what the purpose of the selectmen were, and then they were shocked, I tell you, to find out that we only get paid $900 a year. They thought this was a full-time salary, and I didn't want to, I just said, I think you should carry that forward. Talk to Christine. There was a couple of things. Governor Baker was the keynote speaker for Saturday morning. He brought up the fact that there's pending legislation S10, which will place a 2% tax on real estate transfers to fund environmental resilience projects, which is projecting to generate $130 million a year in revenue. So depending on how you feel about added taxes on real estate transfers versus raising money for environmental stuff, that's in the works, and he's still pushing that one. The other thing that he said that I kind of took away that I appreciated, and he was pretty spontaneous in his talk, but he made a comment that he said when he was a Swampscott selectman, he said, you know, and the whole time I was there, I never knew or, you know, knew previously or know now what the political affiliations were of the people that I was working with. And he said, and then subsequently when I went on to other things, there were most of the people I didn't know. And his comment was that the local level is actually the best model right now that we have of people just coming together trying to make a government work. And certainly given that we're working at the local level, I appreciated the comment. And I thought it was on the mark, given some of the other stuff going on around here.
Of course, the rest set a pretty low bar, so.
Well, it's whatever it takes. I thought it was interesting the governor would see fit to refer back to his experience as a selectman as kind of like a model for how to run a government the right way.
And Karen Polito talks about that too, because I think she was on a select board.
In Shrewsbury.
Yeah. And the other one that I went to was a Parks and Rec presentation, and the only reason it was kind of, I forget what the title of it was. The woman was a former Brookline Park and Rec director, and it was, that entire presentation was totally alien to me in terms of what she talked about, because she talked about how Parks and Rec figures out how they can set the maximum charge for what they do. And her point was a lot of towns basically squeeze Park and Rec to do that because they don't want to fund them. And she was talking about how you can do market analyses and do all these things to figure out how much you can charge. And I was sitting there saying that's never been our philosophy. We've partially funded Parks and Rec, but the fees that Parks and Rec charges are always intended to be fees that people can reasonably expect to handle. Because our program, if nothing else, is designed to get to the people who aren't in a position to go get this stuff all done regardless of the cost. So it's, I kind of came away feeling good about Medfield. Excuse me, the last thing I wanted to just point out, right after I complimented the Register of Deeds, William O'Donnell, he also sends out an annual letter letting us know what how the Community Preservation Act funds have been collected. As you know, we don't have the Community Preservation Act, and we've talked about it a few times, and so far it doesn't make sense for some excellent reasons that, Mike, I still remember from your time on the warrant committee. I still buy into it. But if anybody cares, Medfield, they managed to generate $52,215 from real estate transfer taxes, which apparently is going in to fund the Community Preservation Act pool that then gets distributed out to the people that are participating in the Community Preservation Act. That's all I have.
I had one thing that I didn't close the loop on, which in my discussion with Carol Reed, I did ask her how the Board of Health was going, and she said that the five members, she was down to one member at one point, and she said that they're working very nicely, very well together, and that they want to have communication with the Board of Selectmen. They want Christine to come and to their meetings at some point, and that I told her that we would hope that they would come to our meetings as well, and on an annual basis or something. Very good.
I can vouch for a couple of them for sure from their involvement with ALS. So they're good people on the board. Is there anything else? Comments from the audience? All right, I guess we're done for the night.
Executive session.
Executive session.
Yeah. for tonight here,
Ooh,
an open
yes,
session,
yes.
and then we go into a closed session with the executive session. So we actually
You need to vote.
adjourn this for, or let's see, I
Nope,
guess we
you're
vote
gonna-
to go into. the
You gotta
executive
read the
session.
little script
Yep,
and
yep,
get a
yeah,
motion.
I know.
I picked up 3 new scripts
Only the
at
one,
the annual meeting.
All
Well,
right.
and your group,
Medfield
too.
Board of Selectmen needs to meet in an executive closed session for the following purpose: to consider, it's not, it's excuse 3, to discuss strategy with respect to litigation. I declare that an open meeting may have a detrimental effect on the litigating position of the public body.
And you need to know what they are. They're
Yeah,
on
with
the-
regard to the Medfield police officer, third-party injury claim, and also Chapel Hill Estates litigation, we will not resume an open session at the conclusion of the closed session.
So moved.
Second,
Mr. Marcucci?
yes.
Mr. Murby?
Yes?
Me, yes.
Yes. Right. Thank you, Medfield TV.
The proceeding was a production of Medfield TV, Community Shows.